I think at this point we've all heard of the 80-20 rule. This was popularized by my brother from another mother, Matt Fitzgerald, in his amazing book, 80-20 Running. And the rule very simply states that no more than 20% of your weekly volume should be at a hard effort. And if we were to get a little bit more specific, this means that about 20% or less of your training should be at a lactate threshold or faster. And so this is actually a really good rule for a lot of runners, but I just got a question about within that 20%, what percentage of your paces should be tempo pace, marathon pace, 5K pace, and otherwise a range of paces that we might do in faster workouts? This is actually a really good question, but it's also kind of a trick question. Now here's the thing about the 80-20 rule. It's an estimate. It is not necessarily set in stone, just like the 10% rule when it comes to building your mileage every week. I want runners to think a little bit more critically than blindly following any rule. We should always be listening to our bodies and doing what works best for us, not necessarily what some arbitrary rule says. Now, if we are going to follow the 80-20 rule and have 20% of our mileage be at a certain intensity, that means that let's say we're running 50 miles a week. We'll do this just to keep the math easy. That means 10 miles of that week are going to be at a harder effort. So the question is then, what percentage of those 10 miles should be marathon pace, half marathon pace, tempo pace, 10K pace, 5K pace, and faster? Well, obviously it depends on what kind of race that you are training for. If you're training for a marathon, most of that mileage, if not 90+% of it, should probably be tempo pace or slower. Maybe you're doing a tempo run and you're doing a marathon pace session during the week, and those are your faster running workouts. It might be about 20% of your overall mileage, but you can see that it's actually fairly slow. All those paces are still actually aerobic. Maybe there's a little bit of what Jack Daniels might call repetition work, where let's say you're doing short repetitions at a fairly fast pace, but you're getting plenty of recovery and you're essentially just working on form and turnover and sort of a cardiac output. Those are also really helpful types of workouts for runners, as long as we keep the volume of those workouts low and the recovery high. And if you were training for a much shorter race, like let's say the 5K, then the paces in your training plan are probably going to be skewed a lot more towards the faster end of the intensity spectrum. So you might do one tempo run, but then your other workout is going to be much closer to 5K pace. You might be running short reps at mile or 2 mile race pace. So it certainly depends on the race that you're training for. It also depends, and here's a big one, on when in the season you are. Because if you're in base training, you might actually be doing 95% of your mileage at an easy effort, and you're only doing one short, relatively easy workout per week. And if you're, let's say, the other end of the spectrum, if you're in the competition phase of training, this is where you're getting close to your goal race, your workouts are peaking, you might be doing some tune-up races, you might be doing much harder work at this phase of the training cycle than you were at the very beginning of the cycle. So a good general rule to follow is, as your season progresses over time, you want the intensity of your training to build. And that means the first 25% of your training cycle is not really going to be super intense. You might not be doing 80-20 running. You might be doing 95-5 running. And then as you get into that competition phase of training, the percentage gradually changes so that you might then be doing 90% of your running at an easy pace, and then it's 85% of your running at an easy pace. And then finally you get to that area where, at the end of the season, you might have a month of really hard training, and that is where you do 20% of your total volume at a really hard effort. I could not make these videos without your support. So first, let me say thank you. And this video is brought to you by our very own Performance Training Journal. I have always been in love with hard copy training journals for a few really good reasons. Number one, when I was a new runner and I started keeping an actual training journal like this,
I learned so much more about the sport and myself just by that practice. It really forces you to reflect on your training, to think more deeply about what works for you, what doesn't work for you. And if you are constantly reflecting on your training, praising yourself for what's going right, planning for the future, and then looking back on what has previously worked for you, you are gonna really know yourself as a runner, and you're gonna start to make wiser decisions about your training. I also created this training journal because I want you to focus on the training metrics that actually matter. The training metrics that help you improve, get better, and progress with your running. We don't have to focus on everything. We just need to focus on what matters. I also took a lot of inspiration from professional runners that I've talked to on the Strength Running podcast. They're adamant by completing a training journal and reflecting on what works for you and actually giving yourself some praise within your journal. You're essentially completing a gratitude journal. You are building up your confidence in your own abilities over time. And when you look back on that journal before a big goal race, you are going to be reading in your own words why you're capable, why you can do this. And I can think of nothing more confidence building than an act like that. So I hope you check out the new performance training journal. It is now available on Amazon. It debuted as the #4 new release in the running category, and I could not be more proud of it. So thank you again for subscribing to the Strength Running YouTube channel, and I hope you enjoy the Performance Training Journal.
Now, the other thing about the 80-20 rule is that it's actually a little bit aggressive in my opinion. I actually like to see most intermediate level runners closer to about 85% of their total weekly volume being at an easy effort. And if you're a new runner, let's keep that to 90%. So the 80-20 rule is definitely something just like the 180 cadence rule that we learned from Jack Daniels. This is also a rule that was learned from elite runners. And if we're going to adapt this to ourselves, us middle-aged recreational runners for the most part, it's really important to use some critical thinking and recognize that we can't always run 20% of our weekly volume at a hard effort. Sometimes we have to scale things back because at the end of the day, most runners are limited by their endurance. We are most limited by our aerobic capacity, and aerobic capacity is best built through a lot of easy running. So when in doubt, let's run more at an easy effort, and let's save the harder workouts for that competition phase of training, which isn't a long phase of training, and for when we become much more advanced runners in the years to come. So if you are a new runner, if you are an intermediate runner, don't think 20% of your mileage has to be hard. It can be, but not for the entire season, and you can certainly have some wiggle room within those percentages. So runners, if you're wondering what training plan to choose a plan that you think is reasonable for you. It should be easy at the beginning of the plan, and it should push you in those peak weeks. If you're curious what percentage of total volume is okay to run at a hard effort, it's generally 10 to 20%, but the 20% is aggressive, and the distribution of paces certainly depends on what race you're training for and at what point in the training season that you are. Now, if you do need some help planning your season, figuring out how long it should be, what distance tune-up races to add based on the goal race that you're training for, and how many tune-up races and when to put those tune-up races within your season, download our season planner worksheet. It's going to take all the guesswork out of the season planning process and give you a very simple framework that's going to make success a lot easier to come by.